The day Margaret discovered the document was not dramatic or loud. There was no sudden shock or overwhelming panic, only a quiet disruption that settled slowly in her chest as she stood alone in the small municipal office, holding papers she had requested out of routine rather than suspicion. And as her eyes moved across the unfamiliar dates and signatures, she felt a subtle but unmistakable sense that something in the story of her life had been slightly misaligned, because the information in front of her did not match the version she had carried for decades. And while the clerk continued speaking in a neutral, procedural tone, Margaret barely listened, already retreating inward as memories resurfaced, not as clear scenes, but as emotional impressions, moments where explanations had been thin, answers incomplete, and questions dismissed as unnecessary. And as she left the building and stepped into the afternoon light, she realized that this discovery did not feel like betrayal yet, only like the first crack in a carefully maintained structure, the kind that does not collapse immediately, but forces you to acknowledge that stability was never as solid as it appeared. And as she drove home in silence, she understood that this was not the beginning of confrontation or resolution, but the beginning of awareness. And awareness, once formed, does not fade quietly back into ignorance. That evening, Margaret sat alone in her living room with the document placed neatly on the table in front of her, not reading it again, but feeling its presence like an unanswered question that refused to leave the room. And as the daylight slowly faded, she became acutely aware of how many evenings she had spent in this same space, believing her life was fully understood, believing that familiarity equaled truth. And while the ticking of the clock marked time with indifferent precision, she found herself replaying ordinary moments from the past that now carried a different weight. Conversations that ended too quickly, decisions made without full explanation, and reassurances she had accepted because they were easier than doubt. And she realized that trust, when maintained over decades, often becomes automatic rather than intentional, something preserved through habit instead of clarity. And this understanding brought neither panic nor anger, but a quiet unease, because it suggested that parts of her life had been shaped by information she was never given the chance to evaluate. And as she sat there, she recognized that the discomfort she felt was not caused by what she had discovered, but by what it implied. That her sense of stability had depended on omissions she had unknowingly agreed to. And in that moment, she understood that whatever truth lay ahead would not simply revise her memories, but would require her to reconsider who she had been while living them. And this realization settled slowly, firmly, making it clear that there would be no returning to the ease of unexamined certainty. That evening, Margaret sat alone in her living room with the document placed neatly on the table in front of her, not reading it again, but feeling its presence like an unanswered question that refused to leave the room. And as the daylight slowly faded, she became acutely aware of how many evenings she had spent in this same space, believing her life was fully understood, believing that familiarity equaled truth. And while the ticking of the clock marked time with indifferent precision, she found herself replaying ordinary moments from the past that now carried a different weight. Conversations that ended too quickly, decisions made without full explanation, and reassurances she had accepted because they were easier than doubt. And she realized that trust, when maintained over decades, often becomes automatic rather than intentional, something preserved through habit instead of clarity. And this understanding brought neither panic nor anger, but a quiet unease, because it suggested that parts of her life had been shaped by information she was never given the chance to evaluate. And as she sat there, she recognized that the discomfort she felt was not caused by what she had discovered, but by what it implied, that her sense of stability had depended on omissions she had unknowingly agreed to. And in that moment, she understood that whatever truth lay ahead would not simply revise her memories, but would require her to reconsider who she had been while living them. And this realization settled slowly, firmly, making it clear that there would be no returning to the ease of unexamined certainty. As the day unfolded, Margaret found herself paying attention not to events, but to her own reactions to them, noticing how every small interaction now carried an undercurrent of awareness that had not existed before. And while she answered routine phone calls and completed ordinary tasks, she sensed a growing distance between who she had been and who she was becoming. Because once doubt enters a long-established narrative, it does not announce itself loudly, but quietly reorganizes meaning. And she realized that for years she had relied on emotional efficiency, choosing paths that required the least resistance, convincing herself that peace was maintained through patience rather than mutual transparency. And as she reflected on moments when she had felt dismissed or gently redirected away from uncomfortable topics, she understood that those moments were not accidents but subtle negotiations of power, where silence was rewarded and curiosity discouraged. And this recognition did not make her feel foolish but sober, because it revealed how easily trust can be shaped by consistency rather than truth. And as she allowed herself to remain with these thoughts instead of pushing them aside, she felt an unfamiliar strength emerging, the strength of someone no longer invested in preserving appearances at the cost of understanding. And by the time evening approached, she knew that whatever lay ahead would not be resolved through confrontation alone, but through a sustained commitment to clarity, a commitment that would require her to remain steady even when certainty became uncomfortable. And in accepting this, she felt grounded, aware that the hardest part was not discovering the truth, but allowing it to fully exist without minimizing its significance. That night, Margaret found it difficult to sleep, not because her thoughts were racing, but because they had finally slowed enough to be examined. And as she lay in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the house, she recognized how deeply routine had once protected her from asking questions that required emotional risk. And she reflected on how many years she had equated stability with safety, believing that as long as life appeared orderly, there was no need to disturb its foundations. And yet now, with awareness quietly present, she understood that order without truth is simply a managed illusion, one that demands constant participation from those who benefit from not looking too closely. And as memories surfaced, they no longer appeared random, but connected, forming a pattern she could no longer ignore. Moments of hesitation, explanations that arrived too quickly, reassurances that discouraged further inquiry. And she realized that what she had lost was not only information, but agency, the ability to fully choose her life with complete understanding. And this realization brought neither panic nor urgency, but a steady resolve, because for the first time she felt capable of holding complexity without needing immediate resolution. And as the hours passed, she accepted that clarity does not demand instant action, but it does demand respect. And respecting it meant allowing herself the time and seriousness this truth deserved, even if the path forward remained uncertain. The next day, Margaret left the house earlier than usual, not because she had somewhere specific to go, but because remaining inside felt increasingly restrictive, as though the walls themselves were shaped by years of unspoken agreements. And as she drove through familiar streets, she noticed how often her life had followed paths chosen for convenience rather than intention, routines repeated until they no longer felt like choices at all. And with each passing block, she became more aware that what unsettled her was not the possibility of confrontation, but the realization that she had spent decades adapting herself to an incomplete version of reality, believing that restraint was a form of maturity. And as she parked and sat quietly in the car, she reflected on how easily strength can be mistaken for endurance, how often women of her generation were taught to preserve harmony even when it required personal silence. And this thought did not fill her with resentment, but with clarity, because she could finally see that her patience had been genuine, but also exploited by a system that rewarded her for not asking too much. And in acknowledging this, she felt a subtle shift from passive understanding to active self-respect, realizing that awareness alone was not enough unless it altered how she participated in her own life. And as she stepped out into the open air, she accepted that whatever decisions lay ahead would need to honor not just the truth she was uncovering, but the years she had lived without it, because those years deserved recognition rather than dismissal. And moving forward without that respect would simply repeat the same quiet surrender under a different name. That evening, Margaret did not rush into conversation or confrontation. Instead, she moved through the house slowly, noticing details she had overlooked for years: the worn edges of furniture, the quiet ticking of a clock that had marked time through arguments and reconciliations alike. And she understood that this space had absorbed more of her emotional labor than she had ever acknowledged, because it was here she had learned to soften her reactions, to pause before speaking, to translate discomfort into patience, believing that love required restraint. And yet, as she stood there, she recognized how that restraint had gradually become invisibility, not imposed by cruelty, but enabled by familiarity. And this realization did not arrive with anger, but with a steady heaviness, the kind that settles when illusions dissolve. And as she replayed moments from the past, she saw how often her intuition had been correct, but postponed in favor of peace. How frequently she had sensed something misaligned, yet convinced herself that understanding meant acceptance. And for the first time, she questioned whether endurance had truly been the virtue she was praised for, or merely the expectation placed upon her. And this question lingered, reshaping her understanding of loyalty, because she could now see that loyalty without honesty quietly erodes the self. And as night fell, she did not feel despair, but a sober readiness, an awareness that whatever truth awaited her would no longer be filtered through fear or habit, because she had already crossed the most difficult boundary, the one where silence stops feeling protective and starts feeling costly. And from that point forward, she knew she would no longer participate in her own erasure, even if reclaiming her voice required discomfort, disruption, or the unlearning of everything she had been taught to tolerate. In the days that followed, Margaret noticed a subtle but unmistakable shift within herself, not dramatic or loud, but steady, like a quiet recalibration that affected the way she moved, listened, and even breathed, because she was no longer waiting for cues from him to decide how she felt or what she was allowed to question. And this internal change made familiar interactions feel strangely distant, as if she were observing her life from a step removed, seeing patterns that once felt inevitable now appear optional. And as conversations unfolded, she became aware of how often she had anticipated his needs before her own, smoothing tension before it surfaced, shaping her words to preserve harmony. And realizing this did not fill her with resentment, but with clarity, because clarity carries a different weight, one that does not demand immediate action, but insists on honesty. And as memories surfaced, she understood how easily years can pass when compromise becomes routine and silence is mistaken for stability. Yet she also recognized that awareness, once gained, cannot be undone. And this knowledge did not push her toward confrontation, but toward self-respect, toward the quiet decision to stop negotiating her inner truth. And while nothing outwardly dramatic occurred, no arguments, no confessions, no declarations, something fundamental had already shifted, because she was no longer orienting her life around maintaining appearances. And this subtle realignment, though invisible to others, felt like the beginning of reclaiming a self she had gradually set aside, not out of weakness, but out of love. And now, finally, she was allowing herself to question whether love that requires disappearance is love at all. In the days that followed, nothing on the surface appeared to change. The same rooms, the same routines, the same shared silences. Yet Margaret knew that something irreversible had already taken place within her, because once truth is fully seen, it cannot be unseen. And she moved through her days with a new awareness, noticing how lightly she now carried conversations that once weighed her down, how she no longer felt compelled to fill gaps with excuses or soften realities to protect someone else's comfort. And what surprised her most was not the absence of conflict, but the absence of fear, the quiet understanding that she did not need permission to honor her own experience. And as she reflected on the years behind her, she no longer framed them as wasted or tragic, but as formative, a long education and resilience, compromise, and ultimately clarity. And she recognized that love does not lose its meaning simply because it changes shape, nor does commitment require self-denial to remain valid. And in this acceptance, she felt no urgency to rewrite her life dramatically, no need for declarations or departures, only a steady confidence rooted in self-respect. And when she looked ahead, she no longer asked what she owed others or what was expected of her, but what kind of presence she wished to bring into the years that remained, knowing that peace was not found in preserving illusions, but in standing gently and firmly within the truth. And as she closed this chapter of her life, she understood that healing was not a destination, but a practice, one she would now continue with honesty, dignity, and a quiet strength that belonged entirely to her.